Hello everyone. On behalf of the Biochemical Society and Portland Press, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of our Biochemistry Focus webinar series. Topics in the series include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. Each webinar will give you the opportunity to ask questions via text, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series. Please see the website for more details. My name is Hannah Britt. I'm a lecturer in chemical biology at the University of Leeds and the early career trustee for the Biochemical Society, and I'm going to be your chair for the session today. In this webinar, we'll hear from an expert panel of editors-in-chief from across the Biochemical Society journals. We've got Professor Mark Lemmon, Professor Michael Ryan, and Dr. Ricardo Correa, who will discuss the expectations of reviewers and provide advice on how to write and submit an appropriate high-quality review. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after the panel discussion, but you can also send in your questions at any time during the session. If you have a question, please type it into the question box as shown hopefully on the image on the screen, and we'll try to answer as many as possible as time allows. So if it's okay with all of our experts, I would now like to start the webinar with a panel discussion about the expectations of scientific peer review, how to write an appropriate review, guidance on the use of AI, submitting your report, and routes into peer review. So to kick off with our first question, let's start at the beginning. Mike, could you talk to us a little bit about how editors find reviewers?
Sure, thank you for having us. So I think there's many ways that as editors and associate editors, we look for and find reviewers. One way, of course, is that we are experts in our field and we know quite a few people. So we tend to think about folks that we know in the scientific field and utilize them and invite them. Another way that is pretty common is that authors will often suggest reviewers, although I can't speak for my colleagues. I don't always use the author suggested reviewers, but I do look at them, and if they're appropriate to participate in the review process, I will sometimes add them in there. If it's a topic that I don't know the field particularly well, or I'm not as well versed as something else, I'll just go to PubMed and do searches of the literature and find people that have written timely and topical reviews on the subject or recently published in the area. And then sometimes you just get people contacting you to ask if they can become part of your review system. And typically in that case, I'll just ask them to send me a CV so that I can vet their expertise. And if they seem appropriate, I'll add them to their peer review system so they become part of your journal database that we can search as well to find reviewers. So hopefully that gives a pretty decent summary.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Mark, Ricardo, is there anything that either of you would like to add?
Yeah, I just add that we do actually in the platform for the journal have a database of reviewers which has expertise, keywords, and so forth. And what it also has, and this is I think important, is a record of how many reviews that person has written and roughly what the turnaround time was and so forth. So if you really want to do it, then to be a reviewer, then you kind of gain a reputation through those kinds of databases. So I think that's quite useful. And I have to say that I quite often, particularly in areas which are a little bit away from my central expertise, will use PubMed. But it's important there, I think, to note that both senior authors in papers and reviews are looked at, but also you get a sense if you look through PubMed and doing that of people who've been first author or kind of early author on multiple papers. So using that to identify early career researchers who you can also ask who are building a reputation in that field.
Excellent. And of course, I love to hear getting early career researchers involved. Ricardo, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think a point that was added here on this slide regarding conflict of interest, I think working both ways. So we as editors, we try to engage into that, as Mike indicated, try to avoid sometimes, most of the times, include reviewers as suggested by the authors due to this concern about conflict of interest. But it should work both ways. So and reviewers should be clear about that and should help the journal in that way. So have clear transparency about their expertise in the field and how they are connected or not with the authors on the paper. So it's it is a kind of duty as we are asking for reviewers to act. So we as scientists, we have this duty of engaging to peer review processes, and transparency is key.
Great. So is that, oh, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Related to that, and this is actually worth noting, if you are suggesting authors and reviewers, I actually tend as a regular thing just to do a PubMed of those reviewers with the authors on the paper, just to make sure that that people aren't just bringing on their co-authors, etc., etc. And that's quite useful to do. Mostly people don't do that, but occasionally you'll find people who have been publishing together. If it was a decade ago, that's fine, but it's just worth noting that is something that's checked by many.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I found that there's people that will sometimes maybe they haven't published with them, but they're also not experts in the topic of the paper, and then you just sort of get the sense they're asking their friend to review, and I don't invite those. So it's very useful to vet them.
So is that really what you're looking for in a reviewer, an expert in the field? Is there anything else to consider? Mark, if I can start with you.
Yeah, I think what we're really looking for is someone who is an expert and but simultaneously has a broad view of the field, so you can put it into context. And so, I think the people to suggest are the people that you've seen or give talks or spoken to about research in other different venues, who you sense really have can really contextualize your work well. I think those are the ideal people to suggest.
Ricardo, Mike, anything to add?
Just another point I think is about timing. So we have duties to really support authors and make their science available in the best quality and transparency possible. And we hope that reviewers take in consideration the timing that is needed to really support the journal, support the authors by reviewing properly and return their comments by the due date. So this is helpful, and over time, if there is no such engagement, yeah, unfortunately, we try to discard or even remove these reviewers from the deck.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason that like the database that we have in the journals are useful, as Mark pointed out, because it gives us some metrics on how how timely they are in submitting their reviews, the quality of their reviews, and so if we're using our journal databases, I think those are things that we look at as well to make sure that we're getting somebody that's really done the work before, and it also a lot of editors I think end up having some key people that they go to frequently because they know they're going to provide high quality reviews in a timely way, but we're always looking to get more of those people because it's a challenge to to get enough reviewers in general.
Yeah. So if I could carry on a little bit with the point that you made, Ricardo, which is, I guess I'm interested in what kind of assessments are you expecting from your reviewers? Ricardo, do you want to go first with that one?
Could you repeat that, Hannah?
So what kind of assessments or kind of feedback, I guess, are you expecting from your reviewers when you ask them to review a paper?
Well, I think particularly for Bioscience reports, one topic that's really important across all journals as part of the Biochemical Society team is scientific soundness. So I think authors need to ask, the reviewers need to ask the question if the methods are appropriate, if the controls are adequate, if the data overall is reliable. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration, and is a particular highlight for Bioscience reports, but definitely for all the journals. And then the second topic would be significance and novelty. So again, reviewers should ask if the research that they are looking at is original, is relevant to the biochemical community. So that, yeah, if it's worth moving forward and make publicly available. The clarity and structure, so how the data overall is organized, how the results are presented, if the objectives exposed on the paper, they are well clear, if the conclusions support, so if there is a proper flow of information, and that makes the paper even entertaining to read, to pursue, instead of necessarily just looking at figures, because these days we have such a heavy amount of publications, journals. So most of the time, a lot of people just look at figures and legends, and this is it. But to enrich the process, I think the proper workflow and structure along the paper is important, as well as, of course, the quality of the presentation. So the quality of the figures tables should be clear and professional. So this is something that is important to evaluate, and not just copy and paste from raw data, unprocessed data. So we expect, of course, that there will be raw data, particular Western blots, as additional documentation. So these days, with all issues regarding data manipulation, it's important to expect and have availability of supporting material. And this is something that reviewers should look into it and ask for it if not available. So, and two other topics that I would say are important, and we hope that the reviewers can support in the process, is ethics and transparency, and if the paper is really fit to the journal that they are supporting. So if these are kind of activities that the editorial office and the editors usually take care of, but having support from the reviewers to look if the ethical approvals, data availability, and disclosures are in order, it is welcome. And if the scope overall and depth style of the paper aligns with the journal that they are supporting. So, but definitely the top on my list is really the scientific soundness and the significance and novelty of what we expecting for the paper. So.
Yeah, so a real range of areas for the reviewers to comment on. Mike, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is, peer review system is foundational, right, for science. And as editors, we rely on reviewers to provide us detailed assessment of the topics that Ricardo just mentioned, so that we can make sound judgments on the paper. And so I just think it's important that the reviewers address these topics in a way that we can review them and really make a good judgment as to whether, what the decision on the paper should be.
Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I just comment that that Biochemical Society journals are special journals in that they're society journals that are run by scientists for scientists, and the purpose of them is to transmit information about excellent science that's being done in different labs that submit their work to the different Portland Press Biochemistry journals. And so what a review isn't is an assessment of potential popularity of a paper. And so I think, you know, one shouldn't be being judgmental in the sense of this is cool or this isn't cool. We can leave that to non-society journals that have different rubrics, frankly. And you know, scientific publications started with journals like the Biochemical Journal, which is, you know, over a century old and has over a century of really influencing the field. So really, I think the key for the reviewer is to look at the paper and evaluate it as a piece of scientific scholarship with all of the things that Ricardo and Mike have just said and that are on the screen, and ask, you know, does it pass muster as that? So it's really evaluating the quality of the science. That's really goal number one. And one thing I'd just like to comment on, and this is something that we're very careful about at the Biochemical Journal, is that we have a concept called painless publishing. Now, if you review a paper, you don't want to write a review that basically says, oh, I'd like this paper to be a different paper, and so please do this experiment, that experiment, the other experiment. Yeah, you'll get that from many other journals that you might submit to, and it can take you a couple of years to publish as a consequence. But at the Biochemical Journal, the painless publishing idea is that, you know, the paper that you submit is the paper that is evaluated. And, you know, speaking to several of the things that Ricardo just brought up, we will basically those elements are evaluated, and if they're solid and the paper does indeed, as number 5 says, appropriately advance the field, then it's a good paper. And yeah, I would just comment that for my own self, in my most cited paper in 2024 actually was a 2012 paper in the Biochemical Journal. So I just wanted to make that point. It's really important that you're judging the science, not the, for want of a better word, sexiness of the work, because, you know, that's really what we're here for.
Thanks, Mark. I will always lead with the science, not the sexiness, I guess. Of course, sometimes we end up in a bit of a position where actually, when we're evaluating some of these areas of reviewers, we need to provide some feedback in terms of constructive criticism. So do you have any advice on how a reviewer can provide that constructive criticism in their review? Should we start with you this time, Mike?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think all the topics that we just talked about is being key components of a quality review. They need to be presented constructively by the referees, and that for me a lot of times comes down to how the writing of the review is done. So it's important, the language that one uses in these reviews is important. So like I like to look at these, try to take an approach of like you're having a conversation with the author. And if you were having a conversation with the author, you wouldn't start with, well, you did this, or you didn't do this, or you need, you would say, hey, have you considered, this question, or could you possibly clarify, this, or it's important for this to be included, or this control might be missing. So the language that you use in writing the review, I think, is central to having a constructive review. I do think it's important to start the review to give us as editors an overall concept of the big picture and how the work fits overall in the scientific field and how it may or may not advance the field. And I think that also adds to this. One of the things I've seen a lot over the years, and I suspect Mark and Ricardo have as well, is that if, we're an international group, right? So we have people that have English as a second language. And I have seen many reviewers, make a comment that this needs to be reviewed by a native English speaker. And I really vehemently think you should not do that. I think, you know, if a paper needs improvement in grammar and spelling, just say this requires improvement in grammar with spelling. I think it's somewhat insulting to just assume that that for one, they may not be a native, you know, English speaker, and I think that sets a bad tone as well and is not very constructive. So that's, to me, one of the most common things I've seen. But the language that you use and how you're conveying your feedback, I think, is critical.
Definitely.
Yeah, I wanted to add that. Yeah, I think what Mike mentioned is definitely important, because for some groups this is the first time they are publishing, so it's the product of sometimes years of scientific work and money spent, and there is pride involved into that. And as we as human beings, we can be very sensitive with how we put together words and make comments about what the work of others. So being sensitive on that matter and stick to the science, stick to what is written, and be supportive on making even better, is how professional this should be. So even the interaction of reviewers with editors, sometimes they run short. So it needs, even if the paper is sent out for reviewers to look at, but it doesn't fit on their expertise, so they needs some level of good language and appropriate interaction to avoid burning bridges. So, and I think we are all professionals, we are all scientists, we take pride on our work. So supporting the process and sticking to what is disclosed, what is shown on the paper is the way to go.
Definitely. And I can see you nodding along, Mark, so I'm guessing you're on the same page.
And I would say with respect to reviews, there are several types. A rejection review, for example, where you're suggesting that the paper shouldn't be published in its current form, should start off, as Mike said, by saying, you know, this is a X, Y, and Z et al. You know, address this question, which is an interesting question, and they do this, this, and this, and you know, and there's some interesting data here, but the final conclusion isn't quite compelling enough, and actually what might be useful in order to make it more compelling is this experiment or that experiment, if and only if those experiments are crucial for that to be really a convincing argument. So that should be a rejection review, which is really a constructive approach. And then I think a review where you basically think it's sound, but they could have gone further, would be similar. And what we try to do at the Biochemical Journal, for example, is distinguish between things which are essential to be done to make the paper compelling, versus that would be gravy, and the latter shouldn't be expected. They're just suggested, and that's a nice way of construction. And then finally, I'd say that in terms of the level of detail in the report, you know, some people in their starting reviewing will get a little bit too much in the weeds and correct grammar and language and so on and so forth. That's by and large, I think if you're an author, you tend to think that that's a bit picky, and it can actually, as Mike said, set the wrong tone. So I would leave that out, to be honest, other than just a general statement that, you know, I noticed a few typos. You know, you could even say I'd be happy to pass them on if necessary, but the authors should just go through carefully and correct those. So don't, you know, in other words, I think focusing on the big issues, the science, the extent to which it's convincing is key.
Can I pick up on that first point a bit more, Mark, because I'm interested in what constitutes a kind of fair and appropriate revision request.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that it's kind of in what I just mentioned in some senses. I think that if you look at a paper that's submitted, at least as the Biochemical Journal approach, then go through, you know, it's clear if the authors have done their job what the goal of the paper was. And then it's also typically clear what the conclusion of the paper is. So between those things, you need to have experiments that actually link the goal to the conclusion. And I think that if the experiments that are presented do that and have the appropriate controls, etc., then and that works, then I think that's a paper that should be accepted. If that doesn't work, then I think one should suggest revisions to make that the case, and those are important and essential revisions, like if there's a key control missing, or there's an absolutely obvious key experiment that wasn't done which leaves a big hole. Those are appropriate revisions, and I think those are appropriate essential revisions. But I want to make it clear that there's this distinction between essential revisions and optional revisions. I think it's, and most people in the field, when they're reading a paper, if they're slightly different in a slightly different field, might have a different approach to it. And I think it's okay and good to suggest those as potential revisions, like, what about trying it this way, or that type of revision. But I think those should be suggested in the tone of, this would be really cool if, rather than you must do this. And I think one of the problems some of the vanity journals get into is that those kinds of revisions become essential and the paper can take 3 years to publish. We don't do that. It's one of the things that the editors at Biochemical Journal really focus on is trying to distinguish between those and offer the authors the opportunity to take that advice but not require it for the paper to be published. So I think there are these two classes of essential and optional revisions.
Yeah, none of us want our paper in review and making revisions for 3 years, I think. Ricardo, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I think we cover well. So I agree with Mark and Mike. So I think it's important. Maybe we're going to discuss further. So about the red flags that eventually come up, and this is something that reviewers should be reporting, but most of the times directly to the editorial team. So to avoid any issues with authors or the institutions behind them. So these days we have a lot of coverage, a lot of interference, I would even say, from AI. So it makes sometimes even more difficult to really grasp the reality and the truthfulness of what is included on the paper. But this kind of red flags need to be also paid attention and raised to the editorial team by the reviewers.
Definitely. Mike, anything?
I just would add that when you submit a review, you are writing comments to the authors, but you also will have a field in which you can directly address comments privately to the editors. And I would just encourage authors, when you write your comments for the authors, to not include in those, I recommend this be rejected or accepted, or those are comments that are meant privately for the editors. And frankly, if I see those type of comments in a review, I will scrub them out before before the reviews go out to the authors. I think it's important to know that you can have a conversation separately with with the authors. With the editors.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. What kind of information would you include in those kind of confidential comments to the editors? What would you expect to see from your perspective in that? Do you want to carry on?
So typically, I try not to, I don't like to see a gigantic paragraph, because I want something that's succinct, that's clear, that says this study advanced the field or didn't. It's interesting. It has some weaknesses that are addressable, or it's fatally flawed. And I would and then give me their recommendation there to just briefly justify why they're coming down on the side of their recommendation. So I think something simple and succinct and clear, so that we can also really understand where they're going in terms of their thought process for the review.
Yeah.
It's important to note, I think, that the reviewer is not a decision maker or gatekeeper, but is a consultant for the editor who's making the decision. I think so Mike's comments are spot on, I think. And so I think a review that's predicated on the idea that the reviewer thinks the paper should be rejected actually loses its power as constructive criticism if that statement is made. So I think it's best to avoid. And so yeah, again, I think one needs to summarize what it is and point out the flaws and point out how it could be made better, but remain kind of neutral in the review. I have to say that when I use the confidential comments to the editor aspect, then I tend not to use them too often because some people find them offensive. The idea that there's a kind of secret conversation going on behind the author's view. But sometimes I have to confess what I will use it for is a comment to the editor to say, you know, this paper is just terrible. But then in the authors, I wouldn't say that because I really, going back to Ricardo's comment about respect and professionalism, you don't want to tell people that what they've worked on, you think, you may be wrong, of course, you have to remember that as a reviewer, you may be wrong, that you think it's terrible. So it's worth just pointing out to, so sometimes I'll say, you know, these are key problems I've had with this paper and I hate it. I'll say to the confidential comments, but then in the review, I'll try to say, you know, there is this difficulty and I'll do it politely, but you know, you could potentially fix it in this way or that way or the other way. That then creates a dialogue, going back to Mike's comments that it should be a conversation. That creates a dialogue where if you're wrong as a reviewer, which you often are, then the authors can come back and say, no, you misunderstood. Or yeah, you're right, actually, thank you, we've done this. And then it's done in a professional discursive way rather than this kind of, yeah, let's not be on different sides here. I think that's the key thing that I would say.
Definitely. Ricardo, anything you want to add?
Yeah,
About the
I think
comments?
sensitive matters such as plagiarism, data manipulation, ethical concerns, these issues that eventually the authors are hiding or are really acting in bad faith, but it's still to keep professional and to avoid confrontation. This kind of sensitive matters, I think it's important to have a clear communication from the reviewer to the editor, so then the editor and the editorial office can deal internally and find the best way to resolve and if needed, reject, but in a proper way with proper wording. So having and I agree totally with Mark regarding the having the support of the reviewer as a consultant. So he's not making the final call on that. So it's a kind of teamwork, and we expect the proper support on that. So other things like concerns about this journal scope or integrity of the results, if they found any similar figures in other papers coincidentally, so this could be raised and should be raised as soon as possible, and bias and conflicts on their side. So these sensitive matters, I think these are important to really raise, the earlier the better, and using the confidential comments to the editor.
Yeah, can I just jump in? Sorry, I like Ricardo's comment about being consultants, but not just for the editors, for the authors too. I think that's actually an important relationship for us to have. I have to say, yeah, I've reviewed a lot of papers over the years. I do it a lot. I enjoy it. And one of the things that makes me proud, although it doesn't happen so often these days because journals don't like it, is when you read the paper and it comes out, and in the acknowledgements it says, we thank confidential reviewer #1 for this really good idea, that type of thing. That's happened to me on a few occasions, including from competitors and so forth. So I think that it's important you're trying to help the author as well as the editor, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Definitely, and I guess it goes back to the point about language being so important in terms of how you communicate as a reviewer, both to the authors and to the editors. Now, Ricardo mentioned a little bit earlier about people using AI in terms of preparing their papers. I wonder, where do we stand on can you use AI tools in a review? I think, Mark, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can actually, the best approach here is just to summarize the Portland Press Limited policies on this, which I have written in front of me. And basically the editorial policy of the Portland Press journals, which is aligned with COPE and ICMJE, is that one, and I think this goes without saying, is that reviewers will not use AI tools to summarize the content that they're being asked to review. You submit someone's paper to ChatGPT or Perplexity or whichever, then that becomes part of the the learning set. You've basically broken confidentiality, and that's something that really is inappropriate. So don't do that. And because it is really important to realize that content submitted for review is confidential. Even actually, and many universities have their own ChatGPT local. Don't do that either, because although it's not going very far, you've still basically misappropriated that work to your institutional database. So that's just something that shouldn't be done. And every organization has that. So please don't be tempted to do that. Basically upload, the key being policy-wise, that uploading any article to any of those settings breaks the privacy rules of the publishing house. That said, and this goes back to language and so forth, I think we need to be careful not to prescribe AI use, because it's incredibly valuable for language improvement and so forth. Or actually language homogenization actually is really what it's doing, to be honest. But nonetheless, but that's useful because we respond to different types of language. But AI, it is reasonable to use AI to improve the language and readability of your prepared report. But if you are doing that, it really shouldn't have confidential information in what you put in there. So take that out before. So if you've written a review and you think it's a bit raggedy, and you want some help with kind of tidying it up for whatever reason, then please do take out the, they've done this specific experiment. You take away out the confidential data, and so that's really part of the policy. So it is appropriate to use AI to improve your language, but only if you maintain those privacy rules. What you shouldn't do, however, and this happened to me with an NIH review just recently, is ask ChatGPT to say, write me a review for a paper you think should be rejected. Don't do that. Because that become, and do know also in writing your review that AI detectors are very good, and the editors, if they have any sense of that, can actually instantly see whether you just put them in there, and you can get a very high probability estimate of whether AI was used. And if AI was completely used, then you probably won't be asked to review again. And so I think that's important. So those are the policies with a little bit of extra stuff from me.
Thanks, Mark. I think if that's the policy, we'll stick with that if the rest of the panel is okay. And move on to talk a little bit about what happens after you submit your report. So you've spent this time reviewing the paper. How is the reviewer's report actually used? Can I start with you with that one, Mike?
Sure. The review is used because it's critical as editors for us to have a clear idea of what the advances are made in that paper, and if it's well-controlled study, and if it's essentially just a good quality study, as Mark and Ricardo have pointed out. And so we need to use those to really ultimately make the decision on what's going to happen next with that paper. If we think it's a good quality study that has some issues that can be addressed, but not take 3 years to do so, then we might send that back and ask for revision. And with the idea that if they are responsive and they address the comments appropriately, that it perhaps could be published in the journal. If it's something that there are flaws that can't be addressed, or because it's a poorly designed study, or can't be addressed in a timely way for the authors, we may use those reports to just indicate, this is not the time or the journal, and hopefully the comments that we have for you are helpful for you to improve this work. But ultimately, we need these constructive reports so that we can make decisions as to what will ultimately get published in the journal and what will not.
Great. Ricardo, would you like to add anything?
More like a word of advice. So something that over the years I got used to as a reviewer and as editor is to look into one particular section of papers that sometimes we leave for the one of the last topics to write down. So which is materials and methods. So this for me is usually an entry point to look at the how rich the paper might be, to have an idea about workflow and how solid, how much the authors really try to confront their hypothesis. So it's something that is mostly for me, so I'm not sure if the other editors also follow similar trends, but I really appreciate looking into materials and methods as a start and build from there to come up with a report. So if there is no alignment on what the materials and methods put together with the figures that are disclosed, and if there is discrepancy on the methods and how the work was done, or sometimes they add up more methods than the figures that show up, and they are not, the data is not even included regarding these methods in the supplemental data. So yeah, there is a flaw there, and this needs to be reported to the editor. So this kind of support as consultant and even as kind of detective, I think this is something that we expect from the reviewers with this report.
Great. It's interesting to hear what happens on the other side of the curtain from the reviewers. So if it's okay, I'd like to move now on to talk about routes into peer review, and especially, as I said at the top of the webinar, I'm the early career trustee for the Biochemical Society, so I'd really love to know if you've got any advice to those early in their career about how they can get into peer review. So am I okay to start with you, Mark, for that one?
Sure. So yeah, indeed, make yourself identifiable. So first of all, do good work, but that's everybody who's wanting to be reviewed as doing good work, and so make yourself identifiable both, and there are several ways you can do that: by doing good work and publishing nice papers so that you gain a reputation, by being at meetings and talking to journal editors and talking to people in the field so that they get to know you and get to know that you're switched on and excited about science. And the other thing that Mike mentioned early on is just if you look at a journal particularly, or published there or like it, send a note to the editors or an editor of that journal saying, hey, I work in this field and I do this, and I'd love to have the opportunity to review. So those will help get you in, and keep doing it until you get asked. I would say too that quite often, depending on what lab you're in, your PI may ask you to help with writing reviews. So that's a good route too. The way I got into it actually was I was a postdoc in Yossi Schlesinger's lab, and Yossi got a lot of papers to review from all sorts of journals and would actually, perhaps too much, give them to me to review. And oftentimes people would get back to him with not many comments, and he often wouldn't use them. But I took it very seriously and wrote reviews and learned how to review that way actually. And then he would submit them to the journals and basically make the comment. And you have that this is an option in many journals that did someone help you with this review, and just make the comment. So basically he would say, yeah, Mark Lemmon reviewed this, and then the editors will get a sense that there's not a not bad review written by someone like that. So those are good ways to get in it. Get basically doing good science, doing good reviewing. Those are approaches to get into it. Then but then beyond that, if you do get asked to review, do a good job, and then you'll gain a reputation for it. And if you decide you don't like it, do a bad job and you won't be asked again. But if you like doing it and you want to have that role, then continue with it. I mean, I've done that, and I've reviewed hundreds of papers over the years. And one thing I really like about it is that it gives you a chance to have dialogue with people that you never met before, you didn't know were working in the field, and you can kind of give them your advice in a respectful way on what they're doing, and you may be wrong, you often are, but it means that you are really in your field if you're seeing the things early in that way. So it's really rewarding, and I think the only way to really be rewarded in that way is to approach it with a view to trying to contribute to what the authors are doing rather than trying to judge.
Yeah, if I could, I agree with Mark, and I think one of the considerations, if you have a trainee that's working with you and you're inviting them to review, is make sure that they know this is a confidential communication. And then even if a journal doesn't have like a checkbox, did somebody help you, that's something you can write in the private comments to the editor. But I'd like to add sort of as a general philosophical thing, and I don't know, Mark and Ricardo, if you're experiencing the same, but it seems to me that over the years that I've been an associate editor and now editor-in-chief, that it's becoming more and more difficult to find and secure reviewers for papers. And it strikes me that there's people that maybe they don't think that this is something for them to do, or that maybe they think the paper is outside their specific area of expertise. And I wonder if they're thinking that, I don't know enough. And I think it's important for prospective reviewers to participate in this process, because this is how science moves forward. But it's also important to not be myopic in your thinking about when you're getting invited to review a paper. If it's a paper that's, kind of in your general field and you're just starting out, consider taking it on and doing a good job. That's how you're going to learn. Go to the literature and read about a field. That's how you're going to expand your own knowledge and make your own science better, simply by being part of the peer review system. So don't wait for that perfect paper to come that's exactly in the area where you did your dissertation work. Think broadly. You're a scientist, and you should be able to assess quality science even if it's not exactly perfectly in your niche area.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Mike. I should add to everyone that's in the audience that if you're interested in applying to be added to our reviewer database at the Biochemical Society, then there will be questions in our post-webinar survey. And if you fill those out, your information will be shared and reviewed by the journal editorial staff. So that's a route right from this webinar that will hopefully help some of you get involved in peer review if you're interested. And with that, I think we've just about come to the end of our panel discussion. So if anyone would like more information, anyone in the audience, this slide contains some additional reading and some resources which you can access by clicking on the QR codes. It was actually an absolute pleasure to host this today. So thank you to Mike, Mark and Ricardo for all of your contributions. And I would now like to welcome questions from the audience. So again, if you look at the slide on the screen, it will tell you how you can submit a question through the question box on the screen. So please do start doing that. But in the meantime, we have had some that have already come in. So the first one that I would like to put to you, and anyone feel free to chip in if you have an opinion on this, is what happens when multiple experts review a paper and their opinions disagree or conflict? Would anyone like to take that?
Can I jump in on that? Actually, the Biochemical Journal used to have an approach which it moved away from, where the editor would write a single review that summarized the contents of the reviews that were submitted. I think eLife may do that, or it has done it since. And it was moved away from, and I'm not sure that was a great thing, because oftentimes, as you all know, you get multiple reviews and you'll get conflicting suggestions. So where someone will say this is a good experiment and others will say it's a bad experiment. So that's a problem. And I think the answer is what happens is that's the editor's job, right? Is the editor should look at the reviews and spend the time engaged in the paper. You know, at the Biochemical Journal, for example, and I'm sure, and I know it's the case at BSR too, we don't just, you know, staple the reviews and send them back. Engage in the paper, look at the reviews, and actually the letter from the editor should, if that happens, say, you know, I looked at the reviews, and I think that if you deal with reviewer one on this point and that point, I think then you're going to be good. Or alternatively, if you think it's better to do the other way. So I think the editor needs to kind of, that's the editor's job, is to negotiate that disagreement.
And if I could add, I think that's why quality reviews are so important, because, you know, there are times it's important for us as editors and you as reviewers to make sure that your comments actually reflect what your recommendation is. I've seen, you know, many times where there's a disconnect where somebody might say, oh, this is a great paper, and then give a lot of criticism, and then others that say, oh, this is a, you know, terrible paper, and say almost nothing. And those are the types of things that we as editors need to look at when we're making the decision too. So you might have conflicting, you know, recommendations from reviewers that, you know, one may not be clear in detail and the other one might be, and we have to use those to the best of our ability to make the decisions.
And what we don't do is just take the approach where the author has to appease all of the reviewers. That happens in some journals. It does not happen in our journals.
Correct.
Yeah, when the reviewers come up with the comments, so we as editors, we consider as a bulk, so we put them together, so one complements the other. So, and we need to make the balance. If one of the reviewers just put together reports that was a bit superficial, careless, or the other one was too picky or turned out to be too personal. So as the associate editors, and one escalates to us as editor-in-chief, so we need to make this distinction, this balance. But at the end of the day, so the comments that come up to us from the reviewers, they work together. They should work as a bulk.
Great, thanks everyone. That's really helpful. So we've got another question that's come in. Someone would like to know, as an editor, how do you deal with an inappropriate or insulting reviewer, especially if their scientific opinion or their criticisms are valid, but they've just used that language, which I guess is inappropriate or insulting?
I can.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead,
go
Ricardo.
ahead.
I've directly contacted the. Oh, sorry. So we're talking over each other. I've directly contacted the reviewer. I've actually directly contacted reviewers on the side, and I've actually edited their comments to make them not offensive, to make them more constructive, not changing the content of their criticism, but just to take out language that could be incendiary, and then reached out to them on the side and explained why I did what I did, so that when they see the review that comes out and it is different in language from what they said, they understand, you know, what happened. So I don't think we should shy away from, because that's also helping the process. It's helping them as reviewers to learn how to be more constructive.
Ricardo, did you have anything? I know you were keen to answer as well. So anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, again, as I mentioned earlier, so as human beings, sometimes we had a bad day, so we have this report to put together and send out. So we fail with putting proper wording in place, and it's just put together in the heat of the moment, and it can be offensive. So it needs to wait for the proper moment. So this can be easily escalated. And so the authors are already dealing with the struggle of publishing or having visibility to their study in the community. and is a product of months, years of science, of scientific work. And so they don't need, there is no need to really deal with, besides answering scientific questions and make the work even better, to also deal with the struggles of communication or personal struggles or disrespect. So this is something that needs to be avoided. And there were cases that I saw that reviewers were even very unpolite consistently, and I just request the editorial office to remove them from our database. So this is part of the it's important because it's a part of the culture that also a biochemical society has. So of mutual respect, of sticking to the soundness of the science and the quality and the novelty that we have in our paper. So, and this is where we should sit.
I have dismissed reviews on occasions because they were too unpleasant. That's something that can be done. But I just want to make the point that the technical platforms sometimes make this difficult for editors because increasingly it's automated. So sometimes the reviews can end up going out not without being edited, even if you want to edit them. So I would say if this does happen to you as an author, so don't do it as a reviewer. That's the first thing. If it does happen to you as an author, don't take it personally, because oftentimes it's actually just come directly from the reviewer, if there's a bit of it, without the editor being able to deal with it or change it. We've had problems of that sort. But hopefully the editor will comment on it in their letter. And if they don't, get in touch with the editor and say, hey, wait a minute. And just try and bring it back to being a conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. And unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap up now. So I just want to thank everyone for attending today, and of course to our wonderful panelists for sharing their opinions and experience. People that want to keep the conversation going, you can do that online by following @BiocemicalSoc on Blue Sky and on X. We welcome suggestions for our future webinar topics and speakers to join those webinars in the Biochemistry Focus series. So if you have an idea for a webinar in 2026, please submit a proposal, and you can find out information about how to do that at biochemistry.org. All of our upcoming webinars are listed on the Biochemical Society website, so you can access what's coming up there. And if you've missed any of our more than 100 webinars that have already run, you could also visit our website or YouTube channel to see all of those. And the recording from today's webinar will also be available to watch within the next couple of weeks if you want to watch it again. Finally, I just want to highlight that it's more important than ever to stay connected and engaged with our fellow molecular bioscientists. So I hope that a lot of you will consider joining the Biochemical Society's community of researchers and specialists if you're not already members, and take advantage of some of the key benefits, such as discounted registration fees for our training courses and meetings, access to a wide range of grants and bursaries, online access to the journals, and lots more. And again, you can find more information about all of that on the Biochemical Society website. And with that, it just remains for me to thank our speakers once again. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar, and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.